Chapter 1: The Crime. Carlos stood in the shadows, the cool night air biting into his skin. He was outside the grand estate of Don Fernando, a wealthy merchant known for his ruthless business dealings. The house loomed large and silent, a stark contrast to the bustling market streets Carlos was used to. For weeks, he had observed the household, noting the routines of its inhabitants. He knew tonight would be his only chance. The plan had formed out of sheer desperation. Carlos's mother, Maria, was gravely ill, and the cost of her medication was beyond his meager earnings as a dock worker. Every night, he watched her wither away, powerless to help. The guilt and helplessness gnawed at him until he could bear it no longer. He had to save her, no matter the cost. Dressed in dark clothing to blend with the night, Carlos approached the high wall surrounding Don Fernando's mansion. He had chosen this night carefully, knowing the guards would be minimal and the family away at a distant relative's celebration. With a deep breath, he scaled the wall with surprising agility, landing softly on the other side. The courtyard was eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant chirping of crickets. He crouched behind a large ornamental bush, his heart pounding. The mansion's back door was his target, a door that Don Fernando's servant, an old man with failing eyesight, often forgot to lock. As he crept forward, his mind raced with thoughts of his mother's frail smile and the hope that this night's actions would bring her. He reached the door and tested it gently. It swung open with a soft creak. Inside, the house was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the windows. Carlos moved cautiously, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every shift in the shadows. The layout of the house was familiar to him now, after weeks of observation. He made his way through the kitchen, past the grand dining room, and towards Don Fernando's study, the room where the merchant kept his wealth. Carlos paused outside the study, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The enormity of what he was about to do hit him hard. He wasn't a thief by nature. He was a young man driven to the brink by circumstances. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the image of his mother. He had to be quick. With trembling hands, he picked the lock and slipped inside. The study was luxurious, filled with rich mahogany furniture and shelves lined with leather-bound books. The scent of polished wood and old paper filled the air. Carlos's eyes were drawn to the large desk at the center of the room. On it, he knew, lay the safe, the repository of Don Fernando's ill-gotten gains. He moved quickly, his fingers shaking as he fumbled with the combination he had overheard the merchant boastfully share with a guest. The safe clicked open, revealing stacks of gold coins and bundles of banknotes. Carlos's eyes widened. He had never seen so much wealth in his life. He grabbed a bag from his pocket and began to fill it, his movements frantic but purposeful. Just as he finished, a noise behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly, heart in his throat. There, in the doorway, stood Don Fernando, his eyes blazing with fury. The merchant must have returned home early, and now he stood blocking Carlos's only escape route. "What are you doing here?" Don Fernando's voice was a low growl, full of menace. "Thief!" Carlos stumbled back, clutching the bag of gold. "I am sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, Don Fernando lunged at him. In the struggle, the older man's strength surprised Carlos. They grappled, knocking over furniture and scattering papers. Panic surged through Carlos as he fought to break free. In the chaos, he grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the desk and swung it wildly. The candlestick connected with Don Fernando's head with a sickening thud. The merchant crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around him. Carlos stood there, frozen in shock, the candlestick still in his hand. He hadn't meant to kill him, he only wanted to escape. The realization of what he had done crashed over him like a wave. He had committed murder. The room seemed to spin around him, the walls closing in. He dropped the candlestick and backed away, his eyes never leaving the lifeless body on the floor. He had to get out. He had to run. The thought propelled him into action. He grabbed the bag of gold and fled the study, his footsteps echoing through the silent house. He retraced his steps through the darkened rooms, his mind a blur of fear and regret. Outside, the night seemed colder and darker than before. Carlos ran through the courtyard, scaled the wall, and disappeared into the night. He didn't stop running until he reached the outskirts of the city, where he hid the stolen gold in an abandoned warehouse. Only then did he allow himself to collapse, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. Carlos knew there was no turning back. He had crossed a line and changed his life forever. The image of Don Fernando's lifeless eyes haunted him, a constant reminder of the crime he had committed. All he could do now was hope that the gold he had stolen would save his mother, giving some meaning to the terrible act he had been driven to commit. Chapter 2: The Motive. Carlos had always been known for his dedication and love for his family. From a young age, he had been the primary caregiver for his mother, Maria, after his father had passed away. Maria had worked tirelessly to raise Carlos on her own, ensuring he had food, clothing, and education. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in the fires of hardship and mutual sacrifice. Carlos's life had never been easy. Growing up in a poor neighborhood, he had faced countless challenges, but his mother's strength and unwavering support had always been his guiding light. Maria had fallen ill when Carlos was still a teenager, diagnosed with a chronic and debilitating disease. The illness had taken a heavy toll on her, both physically and financially. The medications she required were expensive, far beyond the reach of their limited income. Carlos had tried everything to secure honest work. He took on multiple jobs, from laboring at the docks to working in a local bakery. Despite his best efforts, the money he earned was barely enough to cover their basic needs, let alone the costly medicine his mother needed. Each day, he watched her health decline, her once vibrant spirit diminished by the pain and suffering she endured. As Maria's condition worsened, Carlos's desperation grew. The sight of his mother's frail body and the sound of her labored breathing haunted him. He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for not being able to provide for her, a burden that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't stand idly by while the person who had sacrificed so much for him slipped away. Carlos sought help from local charities and appealed to the church, but the assistance they could offer was minimal. He even considered selling their small, dilapidated home, but the amount it would fetch wouldn't be enough to sustain Maria's long-term treatment. The more he searched for solutions, the more hopeless the situation seemed. It was during one of these desperate moments that Carlos first entertained the thought of stealing. It was a notion that horrified him, conflicting with the moral values his mother had instilled in him. Maria had always taught him to be honest and upright, no matter how difficult life became. But as he watched her condition deteriorate, his moral compass began to waver. One evening, as Carlos sat by his mother's bedside, he held her hand and made a silent vow. He would do whatever it took to save her. The love and devotion he felt for his mother overshadowed any reservations he had about the methods he might employ. He began to rationalize his thoughts, convincing himself that desperate times called for desperate measures. The idea of stealing from the rich to save his mother's life started to seem less like a crime and more like an act of survival. Carlos's mind turned to Don Fernando, the wealthy merchant whose mansion towered over the neighborhood like a symbol of unattainable luxury. Don Fernando was known for his ruthless business practices, amassing his fortune through exploitation and greed. To Carlos, stealing from such a man didn't feel entirely wrong. It felt like taking back a small part of what the merchant had unfairly accumulated. In the weeks that followed, Carlos meticulously planned his course of action. He spent his days working and his nights observing the routines of Don Fernando's household. He noted the comings and goings of the servants, the guards' patrol schedules, and the times when the house was least occupied. Each detail was etched into his memory, forming a comprehensive blueprint for the night he would execute his plan. As the day of the heist approached, Carlos's internal conflict intensified. He grappled with the moral implications of his decision, but each time he saw his mother struggling to breathe, his resolve strengthened. The thought of losing her was unbearable. He reminded himself that the end justified the means. If stealing could save his mother's life, then it was a price he was willing to pay. The night before the planned theft, Carlos sat by his mother's side, holding her hand gently. Maria's once bright eyes were now dull and filled with pain, yet she managed to smile weakly at her son. She was unaware of the turmoil raging within him, unaware of the desperate lengths he was about to go to for her sake. "Carlos," she whispered, her voice frail. "You've always been my strength. Promise me you'll stay true to yourself, no matter what happens." Tears welled up in Carlos's eyes. He nodded, unable to speak, the weight of his promise pressing heavily on his heart. He kissed his mother's forehead and swore to himself that he would save her, even if it meant losing his own soul in the process. The day of the heist dawned like any other. Carlos went through the motions of his daily routine, but his mind was consumed by the impending act. As night fell, he steeled himself for what was to come. The plan had to be executed flawlessly, there was no room for error. When the moment arrived, Carlos felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The desperation that had driven him to this point had crystallized into a focused determination. He moved with purpose, driven by the image of his mother's smile and the hope that this act would give her a chance at life. As he scaled the wall of Don Fernando's mansion and slipped into the house, Carlos was acutely aware of the line he was about to cross. Every step he took inside the grand estate was a step away from the person he had always strived to be. But with each movement, he reassured himself that this was the only way. His mother's life depended on it. The confrontation with Don Fernando, the struggle, and the accidental death of the merchant were events that Carlos had not foreseen. As he fled into the night, the bag of stolen gold clutched tightly in his hands, he knew that his actions had forever altered the course of his life. He had committed an unthinkable act, driven by a love so profound that it had eclipsed his moral judgment. Carlos's heart was heavy with the weight of his crime, but his thoughts were consumed by his mother. He hoped fervently that the gold he had taken would be enough to secure the treatment she needed. The end, he believed, justified the means. It was a belief born out of desperation, a belief that now, in the cold light of reality, felt both hollow and irrevocably true. Chapter 3: The Escape. The night was ink black, with only the faintest sliver of moonlight guiding Carlos as he fled through the narrow alleys of the city. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the crime he had just committed. The bag of gold felt like a leaden weight, pulling him down with every step. His thoughts were a chaotic whirl of fear, guilt, and desperation. Carlos's journey to the outskirts of the city was a blur. He kept to the shadows, avoiding the main roads and any prying eyes that might see him. The city's usual nocturnal sounds, stray dogs barking, the distant hum of a few late-night revelers, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence of his own thoughts. He knew he had to find a place to hide the gold, somewhere no one would think to look. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the abandoned warehouse. It was a decrepit building, long forgotten by the city's inhabitants, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. The place had an eerie stillness, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Carlos's mind. He pushed open the rusted door, the creak echoing through the empty space. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of broken crates and discarded machinery. Carlos found a spot in the farthest corner, behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets. He dug a small hole in the dirt floor and buried the bag of gold, covering it carefully to leave no trace. As he finished, he took a moment to catch his breath, leaning against the cold, damp wall. But there was no relief in the solitude. The image of Don Fernando's lifeless body haunted him, the merchant's eye staring blankly at the ceiling, a thin stream of blood pooling around his head. Carlos squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the memory, but it was burned into his mind. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to go home and pretend nothing had happened. The walk back to his neighborhood felt longer than it ever had before. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every sound a possible indication of pursuit. Carlos kept his head down, moving quickly but cautiously, trying to maintain an air of normalcy. He couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. When he finally reached his small, run-down home, he paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He had to act normal. He had to be strong for his mother. He opened the door quietly, slipping inside. The familiar scent of home, a mixture of old wood, dampness, and his mother's faint perfume, greeted him, but it did little to calm his racing heart. Maria was asleep in her bed, her breathing shallow and labored. Carlos watched her for a moment, a pang of sorrow and guilt twisting in his gut. He had done this for her, but at what cost? He pushed the thought away and went to his small room, collapsing onto the bed fully clothed. Sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Don Fernando's lifeless form. He could still feel the weight of the candlestick in his hand, the sickening thud as it connected with the merchant's head. The horror of that moment replayed over and over in his mind, a relentless cycle that left him trembling and drenched in sweat. Carlos lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. What if someone had seen him? What if the police were already looking for him? He had left no witnesses, but the fear of being caught gnawed at him. He imagined the knock on the door, the police dragging him away in front of his mother. The thought was unbearable. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, Carlos forced himself out of bed. He had to keep going, to maintain the facade of normalcy. His mother depended on him. He washed his face in a small basin, the cold water shocking him into a semblance of wakefulness. He needed to check on Maria and prepare her breakfast before heading out to work. In the kitchen, he moved mechanically, his mind still reeling. He boiled water for tea and prepared a simple meal, the routine actions grounding him slightly. When Maria awoke, he greeted her with a forced smile, masking the turmoil inside. She was too weak to notice the strain in his voice, the shadows under his eyes. "Carlos, you look tired," she said softly as he helped her sit up in bed. "I didn't sleep well, that's all," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "How are you feeling this morning?" Maria sighed, her frail body sinking back against the pillows. "A bit better, I think. Thank you for everything you do for me." Her words were a dagger to his heart. He had committed an unthinkable act, and yet here she was, expressing gratitude. He nodded, unable to speak, and handed her the cup of tea. As she sipped it, Carlos felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him even more heavily. He had to find a way to make things right, to ensure that the sacrifice he had made would not be in vain. Throughout the day, Carlos went through the motions of his life, his mind a constant storm of anxiety and guilt. At work, he kept his head down, avoiding conversation and eye contact. The other dock workers noticed his unusual silence, but no one questioned him. They all had their own struggles, their own secrets. By evening, Carlos was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He returned home, the fear of discovery still hanging over him like a dark cloud. He checked on his mother, making sure she was comfortable, before retreating to his room once more. Sleep remained elusive, the night's events replaying in his mind in a relentless loop. Over the next few days, Carlos tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He worked, cared for his mother, and kept a low profile. But the strain was taking its toll. He became jumpy, reacting to every unexpected sound, every sudden movement. His co-workers began to whisper among themselves, sensing that something was deeply wrong. One evening, as Carlos was walking home from the docks, he noticed a figure following him. His heart raced, and he quickened his pace, ducking into an alley. He pressed himself against the wall, peering around the corner. The figure continued past the alley without stopping, but the encounter left Carlos shaken. Paranoia gnawed at him, feeding his fear that someone knew what he had done. He couldn't continue like this. The guilt and fear were consuming him, making it impossible to think clearly. He needed to find a way to calm his mind, to find some semblance of peace. But every time he tried to rationalize his actions, the image of Don Fernando's lifeless body loomed large, a stark reminder of the price he had paid. Carlos knew he couldn't undo what had been done. The gold he had stolen was hidden, but it was a constant reminder of his crime. He had committed murder, and no amount of rationalization could change that fact. All he could do now was focus on his mother and hope that, somehow, the gold would be enough to save her. In the weeks that followed, Carlos found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. He continued to work, to care for his mother, but the weight of his actions never left him. Each day was a struggle, a battle against the crushing guilt and fear that threatened to overwhelm him. Despite everything, Carlos's love for his mother remained his guiding light. He had committed the crime to save her, and he would do whatever it took to ensure that she received the treatment she needed. But the path he had chosen was fraught with danger, and he knew that any misstep could bring everything crashing down. One night, as Carlos sat by his mother's bedside, he took her hand and made a silent vow. He would protect her, no matter the cost. He had already sacrificed his soul for her, and he would continue to fight, to endure the torment of his guilt, if it meant giving her a chance at life. But deep down, Carlos knew that the shadows of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. The escape from Don Fernando's mansion was only the beginning. The true challenge lay in living with the consequences of his crime, in finding a way to reconcile his love for his mother with the dark reality of what he had done. As the days turned into weeks and then months, Carlos continued to navigate the precarious balance between his duty to his mother and the ever-present fear of discovery. The gold remained hidden in the abandoned warehouse, a silent testament to the lengths he had gone to in order to save her. And though the weight of his guilt never lessened, Carlos found solace in the knowledge that he had acted out of love, driven by a desperate need to protect the person who meant everything to him. Chapter 4: The Guilt. Days bled into weeks, and the burden of Carlos's guilt grew increasingly oppressive, like a heavy chain wrapped around his soul. Each passing day felt longer than the last, the weight of his actions eroding his spirit and his sense of self. The memory of the night he stole the gold and took Don Fernando's life haunted him, an ever-present spectre that refused to be banished. Carlos's appearance began to reflect the turmoil within. He grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, his cheeks sunken from lack of food and rest. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his once lively eyes were now dull and haunted. He moved through his daily routine like a ghost, a mere shadow of the person he once was. The simple acts of eating and sleeping became Herculean tasks. Food turned to ash in his mouth, each bite a reminder of the blood money that had bought it. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by endless nights of staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of that fateful night in an unending loop. He would toss and turn, sweat-soaked sheets clinging to him as he relived the moment of impact, the sickening thud of the candlestick against Don Fernando's skull. Carlos's mother, Maria, was quick to notice the changes in her son. She had always been attuned to his moods, and the drastic transformation in him filled her with concern. She would watch him with worried eyes, her heart aching to see the pain etched on his face. But whenever she asked him what was wrong, he would brush her off with a forced smile and a weak assurance that everything was fine. "You're not eating, Carlos," Maria said one evening, her voice frail yet firm. "You look like you haven't slept in days. Please, talk to me. What's troubling you?" Carlos avoided her gaze, unable to meet her eyes. The guilt of lying to her was almost as unbearable as the guilt of his crime. "I'm just tired, Mama. Work has been hard lately. There's nothing to worry about." Maria reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "You can't fool me, Carlos. I've known you your entire life. Something is eating away at you. Please, let me help." Carlos felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. How could he possibly tell her the truth? How could he confess that he had killed a man and stolen his wealth to save her? The thought of seeing the disappointment and horror in her eyes was more than he could bear. "I'm fine, Mama," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I promise." But Maria was not convinced. She watched him closely, her concern deepening with each passing day. She saw the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he constantly looked over his shoulder as if expecting to be caught. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes, and the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. She could sense the fear and guilt that consumed him, even if she didn't know the cause. Carlos tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was a losing battle. The fear of being discovered was a constant drumbeat in his mind, growing louder with each passing day. Every knock on the door made his heart leap into his throat. Every unfamiliar face on the street was a potential threat. He avoided interactions with his neighbors and co-workers, fearful that they might see through his facade and uncover the truth. His work at the docks suffered. Once a diligent and hard-working employee, Carlos now struggled to keep up with his tasks. His mind was always elsewhere, lost in a haze of guilt and fear. His co-workers noticed the change and whispered among themselves, speculating about what might be wrong with him. But Carlos was too consumed by his own torment to care. One evening, as he sat alone in his room, Carlos's resolve finally began to crack. The weight of his guilt was too much to bear alone. He needed to unburden himself, to confess his sins, and seek some form of absolution. But who could he turn to? Who could he trust with a dark secret that had poisoned his soul? He thought about going to the church and confessing to Father Alejandro. The priest was known for his compassion and understanding, and Carlos had attended his sermons many times. But the thought of revealing his crime, of seeing the disappointment and judgment in Father Alejandro's eyes, was too much to bear. He couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, Carlos took to writing. Late at night, when the house was silent and the only sound was the distant hum of the city, he would sit at his small desk and pour his heart onto the pages of an old, worn notebook. He wrote about his love for his mother, his desperation, and the night he committed the unthinkable. He described the guilt that gnawed at him, the fear that stalked his every step, and the crushing weight of his actions. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to unburden his soul, even if only temporarily. The pages filled quickly, each one a testament to his inner torment. But as cathartic as it was to put his thoughts into words, it did little to ease his guilt. The act of writing could not undo what had been done. Maria continued to watch her son with growing concern. She saw the toll that his guilt was taking on him and knew that something had to be done. One evening, as Carlos was helping her prepare for bed, she decided to confront him once more. "Carlos," she said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "I know you're hiding something from me. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. Please, let me help you." Carlos looked at his mother, her frail form and tired eyes filled with love and concern. The urge to confess, to finally unburden himself, was overwhelming. But the fear of losing her, of seeing the disappointment and horror in her eyes, held him back. "I can't, Mama," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I can't tell you." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled him into a gentle embrace. "Whatever it is, my son, we will face it together. I love you, and nothing will ever change that." Carlos clung to his mother, tears streaming down his face. The guilt and fear that had consumed him felt slightly lighter in her embrace, but the burden of his secret remained. He knew that he would have to find a way to live with his actions, to somehow make peace with what he had done. The days continued to pass in a blur of guilt and fear. Carlos's mental and physical health continued to deteriorate, and his mother's concern grew. Despite her frailty, Maria tried to support her son in any way she could, offering words of comfort and encouragement. But Carlos knew that her love and support could only do so much. The real battle was within himself. One night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Carlos made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to atone for his actions. He would use the stolen gold to secure the medical treatment his mother needed, but he would also find ways to give back, to help others in need. He would volunteer at the church, donate to local charities, and do whatever he could to make amends for the life he had taken. It was a small step, but it was something. Carlos knew that the road to redemption would be long and difficult, but he was determined to walk it. He owed it to his mother, to Don Fernando, and to himself. As the first light of dawn crept through the shutters, Carlos rose from his bed with a sense of purpose. The guilt and fear still lingered, but he was no longer paralyzed by them. He had a plan, a way to begin making things right. Carlos went to his mother's room and found her awake, a small smile on her lips as she saw him. "Good morning, Carlos," she said softly. "You look better today." He returned her smile, the first genuine smile he had managed in weeks. "I have a lot to make up for, Mama," he said, his voice steady. "But I promise you, I will." Maria reached out and took his hand, her grip reassuring. "I know you will, Carlos. I believe in you." Carlos squeezed her hand, feeling a renewed sense of hope. He couldn't undo the past, but he could work towards a better future. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer alone. With his mother's love and support, he would find a way to atone for his actions and find some measure of peace. Chapter 5: The Investigation. The murder of Don Fernando, a well-respected and affluent merchant, sent shockwaves through the community. The brutality of the crime and the theft of a significant sum of gold made headlines, and the police were under immense pressure to solve the case quickly. Detective Inspector Ricardo Marquez, a seasoned officer, was assigned to lead the investigation. Marquez arrived at the crime scene early the next morning, meticulously examining every detail. The merchant's body lay in a pool of blood, the room in disarray, and the safe pried open and empty. The detectives and forensic team combed through the evidence, searching for any clues that might lead them to the killer. News of the murder spread like wildfire, and the neighborhood buzzed with rumors and speculation. The police began their investigation by interviewing everyone who might have information about the crime, but none of the leads yielded significant results. Detective Marquez decided to expand the scope of the investigation, instructing his team to question everyone in the neighborhood. Carlos, like many others, was approached by the police. He had been living in a state of heightened anxiety, his guilt and fear making it difficult to maintain his composure. The knock on his door early one morning sent a jolt of terror through him, but he steadied himself before opening it. Two uniformed officers stood on his doorstep, asking if he had known Don Fernando or noticed anything unusual the night of the murder. Carlos, trying to keep his voice steady, explained that he had been home with his sick mother. The officers took notes, their expressions neutral, but Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that they were scrutinizing his every word. When they left, he closed the door and leaned against it, his legs feeling weak. Despite his best efforts to remain composed, Carlos's anxiety only grew. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, jumping at every unexpected sound and constantly looking over his shoulder. His behavior did not go unnoticed by the police, who had begun to compile a list of potential suspects. Detective Marquez, reviewing the notes from his team, noticed Carlos's name and remarks about his nervousness. Deciding to take a closer look, Marquez paid Carlos another visit, hoping a more personal approach might yield better results. Carlos, feeling a sense of dread, let the detective in. Marquez began with casual questions about Carlos's work and his relationship with his mother. The conversation flowed smoothly at first, but then Marquez's tone shifted, becoming more probing. "Carlos, I've been doing this job a long time. If there's anything you're not telling us, now would be the time to come clean." Carlos's heart raced, but he managed to keep his composure. "I've told you everything I know, detective." Marquez studied him for a moment before nodding. "Very well, Carlos. But if you do remember anything, please contact me." As the detective left, Carlos felt a mixture of relief and dread. He had managed to maintain his composure, but he knew that he was still under suspicion. The police were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they uncovered the truth. One evening, as Carlos walked home from the docks, he noticed a police car parked down the street from his house. Panic surged through him, and he ducked into an alley, watching as the officers spoke to his neighbors. He waited until the police car drove away before cautiously making his way home. His mother, Maria, was waiting for him, her expression worried. "Carlos, the police were here again. They were asking about you." Carlos forced a smile, trying to hide his fear. "It's just routine, Mama. They're questioning everyone." Maria took his hand, her grip gentle but firm. "Carlos, please. If there's something you're not telling me, you need to. We can face it together." Carlos looked into his mother's eyes, seeing the love and concern there. The urge to confess was overwhelming, but the fear of losing everything was too great. "I promise, Mama. There's nothing to worry about," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The investigation pressed on, and the police continued to monitor Carlos closely. Detective Marquez remained convinced that Carlos knew more than he was letting on. One night, as Carlos made his way to the abandoned warehouse where he had hidden the gold, a plainclothes officer followed him and reported his findings. Marquez arrived shortly afterward, and they quietly approached the warehouse. Inside, Carlos was digging up the bag of gold, his hands trembling. As he lifted the bag, the door burst open, and Marquez and the officer stepped inside, their guns drawn. "Carlos Hernandez, drop the bag and put your hands in the air," Marquez commanded. Carlos froze, the bag slipping from his grasp. He raised his hands, his eyes wide with fear. "Please, I can explain," he stammered. Marquez stepped forward, his expression stern. "It's over, Carlos. You're under arrest for the murder of Don Fernando." Carlos felt his world collapse around him. The guilt and fear that had consumed him had led to this moment. As the officers handcuffed him and led him away, he felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of his secret was finally lifted, and though he faced an uncertain future, he no longer had to carry the weight of his guilt alone. Chapter 6: The Confession. The burden of guilt had become an insurmountable weight pressing down on Carlos's shoulders, consuming him with each passing day. The endless torment of living with his dark secret had eroded his spirit, leaving him hollow and broken. Night after night, he lay awake, tortured by the memory of his actions and the fear of being discovered. But it was the thought of his mother, suffering and in need, that finally pushed him to the brink. One night, as the city slept, Carlos made a decision that would change his life forever. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, he left his mother sleeping peacefully in her bed and ventured out into the cool darkness. The streets were empty, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the city. Carlos walked with purpose, his mind consumed by thoughts of confession and redemption. He arrived at the police station just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The building loomed before him, imposing and foreboding, but Carlos felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had made his decision, and nothing could deter him now. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Carlos pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur of voices. Carlos approached the front desk, where a tired-looking officer glanced up at him with mild curiosity. "I need to speak to someone," Carlos said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging within him. The officer regarded him for a moment before nodding. "Of course. Please wait here." Carlos took a seat in the worn plastic chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he was about to do would have far-reaching consequences, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do. He couldn't continue to live with the weight of his guilt, and he couldn't bear to see his mother suffer any longer. Moments later, a door opened, and a stern-faced detective stepped into the room. "How can I help you, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Carlos swallowed hard, steeling himself for what he was about to do. "I need to confess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The detective's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he motioned for Carlos to follow him. Together, they entered a small, windowless room at the end of the hallway, where the detective motioned for Carlos to take a seat. "Go ahead," the detective said, his tone encouraging but expectant. And so, Carlos began to speak. He told the detective everything, starting from the day he learned of his mother's illness to the night he committed the unthinkable act of stealing from and killing Don Fernando. He spoke of the desperation that had driven him to such extremes, the guilt that had consumed him in the aftermath, and the fear that had haunted him every waking moment. The detective listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Carlos had finished speaking, there was a long moment of quiet as the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Finally, the detective spoke, his voice grave. "What you've done is serious, Carlos. There are consequences for your actions." Carlos nodded, his eyes downcast. He knew that he would have to face the consequences of his crimes, whatever they may be. But he also felt a strange sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The detective regarded him for a long moment before reaching across the table and placing a hand on his shoulder. "But you've also taken the first step towards redemption. It won't be easy, but it's possible. And you won't have to face it alone." Carlos looked up, tears shining in his eyes. He had expected anger and judgment, but instead, he found compassion and understanding. In that moment, he knew that he had made the right decision. As they left the interrogation room together, Carlos felt a weightlessness he hadn't known in months. The sun was rising in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the city streets. He knew that his journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. And with that hope, he knew that anything was possible. Chapter 7: The Trial. The wheels of justice turned swiftly for Carlos Hernandez. His decision to confess had set into motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to his trial. As he sat in the courtroom, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and the weight of his actions, Carlos couldn't help but feel a sense of resignation. He knew that he would have to face the consequences of his crimes, but he had hoped that his confession would earn him some leniency. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their case against Carlos. The evidence against him was damning: his confession, forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene, an eyewitness testimony placing him in the vicinity of the murder on the night in question. Despite his initial hopes for leniency, Carlos realized that the odds were stacked against him. Throughout the proceedings, Carlos listened in silence as the prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer driven by greed and desperation. They recounted the events of the night of the murder, portraying Carlos as a calculating criminal who had callously taken the life of an innocent man for his own gain. As the trial progressed, Carlos's mind drifted back to that fateful night, the fear, the desperation, the overwhelming sense of guilt. He had never intended for things to go so far, but in his desperation to save his mother, he had made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When it was his turn to testify, Carlos stood before the court and recounted his story once more. He spoke of his mother's illness, his inability to afford her medication, and the desperation that had driven him to commit the unthinkable act of theft and murder. He spoke of his remorse and his decision to confess, hoping that his honesty would earn him some measure of mercy. The judge listened attentively as Carlos spoke, his expression grave but not unkind. When Carlos had finished, there was a long moment of silence as the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Carlos Hernandez, you have been found guilty of the murder of Don Fernando and the theft of his property. Your confession and the evidence presented against you leave no doubt as to your culpability in these crimes." Carlos felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach as the judge continued. "While I am moved by your story and the circumstances that led you to commit these acts, I am bound by the law to uphold justice. Therefore, it is my duty to impose upon you a sentence commensurate with the severity of your crimes." Carlos closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. He knew that no amount of remorse or regret could undo what he had done. He had taken a life, and now he would have to pay the price. "Carlos Hernandez," the judge said solemnly, "I hereby sentence you to 20 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 15 years. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the sentence was handed down. Carlos felt a sense of numbness wash over him as he was led away, his fate sealed by the decisions he had made. As he was escorted from the courtroom, Carlos couldn't help but feel a sense of resignation. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he had to face it with courage and determination. He had made mistakes, grave mistakes, but he was determined to use his time in prison to reflect, to atone for his actions, and to emerge a better man. With that thought in mind, Carlos turned his gaze forward, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 8: The Punishment. Life behind bars was a stark contrast to the world Carlos had known before. In prison, time seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each day bleeding into the next in a monotonous rhythm. But amidst the harsh realities of his confinement, Carlos found himself grappling not only with the physical confines of his cell, but also with the weight of his own conscience. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Carlos struggled to come to terms with the enormity of his actions. The memory of Don Fernando's murder weighed heavily on his soul, a constant reminder of the irreparable harm he had caused. But amidst the darkness of his despair, Carlos found a flicker of hope, a glimmer of redemption that beckoned to him from the shadows. Determined to confront his past and seek forgiveness for his sins, Carlos embarked on a journey of self-discovery within the confines of his cell. He spent his days immersed in books, seeking solace and wisdom in the words of philosophers and poets long gone. He devoured works on morality and ethics, grappling with questions of right and wrong, good and evil. But it was not only through books that Carlos sought redemption. He also turned inward, engaging in deep introspection and reflection on his own actions. He confronted the demons that haunted him, acknowledging the darkness within himself and striving to overcome it. He sought solace in prayer, seeking guidance and forgiveness from a higher power. As time passed, Carlos's transformation became evident to those around him. He became known as a model prisoner, his quiet demeanor and steadfast resolve earning him the respect of both inmates and guards alike. He volunteered in the prison library, helping his fellow inmates access educational resources and expand their minds. He participated in therapy sessions and support groups, offering a listening ear and words of encouragement to those in need. But perhaps most importantly, Carlos sought to make amends for his past actions in whatever small ways he could. He reached out to Don Fernando's family, expressing his deepest regrets and offering whatever assistance he could to help ease their pain. Though his efforts were met with mixed reactions, Carlos remained undeterred, knowing that true forgiveness could only come from within. In seeking redemption, Carlos found a sense of purpose that transcended the confines of his prison cell. He realized that true forgiveness could only be achieved through genuine remorse and a commitment to change. And so, he vowed to spend the remainder of his days working tirelessly to atone for his past sins and to emerge from his confinement a better, more compassionate man. As the years passed, Carlos's efforts bore fruit. He earned the respect of his fellow inmates and the admiration of the prison staff. He became a beacon of hope in a place often devoid of light, a testament to the power of redemption and the resilience of the human spirit. And though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, Carlos faced it with courage and determination, knowing that he had finally found the path to redemption. For in the darkness of his confinement, he had discovered a light that burned bright within him, a light that would guide him through the darkest of nights and lead him towards a brighter tomorrow. Chapter 9: The Redemption. The day of Carlos Hernandez's release from prison marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter defined not by the mistakes of his past, but by the unwavering determination to make amends and seek redemption. Stepping out into the world after a decade behind bars, Carlos felt a strange mixture of trepidation and hope. The city streets, once so familiar, now seemed foreign and intimidating. But amidst the uncertainty, he clung to the flicker of hope that had sustained him through the darkest of nights, the belief that he could still make a difference, that he could still find redemption. Returning to his old neighborhood, Carlos was met with mixed reactions from those who knew him. Some welcomed him back with open arms, eager to offer support and encouragement as he sought to rebuild his life. Others, however, eyed him with suspicion and distrust, unable to forgive him for the pain he had caused. But Carlos refused to be deterred by the doubts and judgments of others. He knew that true redemption could only be achieved through action, through a steadfast commitment to righting the wrongs of his past. And so, he threw himself into the task with renewed vigor, determined to prove that he was worthy of a second chance. The first order of business was to reunite with his beloved mother, Maria. As he embraced her tightly, tears streaming down his cheeks, Carlos felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Despite the pain and heartache he had caused her, Maria had remained steadfast in her love and support, never once giving up on her son. With Maria by his side, Carlos set out to rebuild his life from the ground up. He secured a job at a local construction company, his strong work ethic and determination earning him the respect of his colleagues. Though the work was hard and the hours long, Carlos approached each task with a sense of purpose, knowing that every brick laid and every beam raised brought him one step closer to redemption. But it was not enough for Carlos to simply work towards his own redemption, he also sought to make amends to those he had wronged. With the help of a parole officer, he reached out to the families affected by his crime, expressing his deepest regrets and offering whatever assistance he could to help ease their pain. Some were hesitant to forgive him, their wounds still raw from the loss they had suffered. But Carlos refused to give up, determined to prove that he had changed, that he was no longer the same man who had committed those terrible acts so many years ago. Slowly but surely, Carlos began to rebuild the bridges he had burned. He volunteered at a local soup kitchen, serving meals to the less fortunate and offering words of encouragement to those in need. He participated in community cleanup efforts, helping to beautify the neighborhoods he had once terrorized. And through it all, Carlos remained guided by the unwavering belief that redemption was possible, that no matter how far he had fallen, he could still find his way back to the light. As the years passed, Carlos's efforts bore fruit. The scars of his past began to heal, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had faced his demons head-on and emerged victorious. He became a pillar of strength in his community, a living testament to the power of redemption and the resilience of the human spirit. And though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, Carlos faced it with courage and determination, knowing that he had finally found his way back to the path of righteousness. For in the end, it was not the mistakes of his past that defined him, but the strength and resilience with which he faced them. And in that realization, Carlos found the true meaning of redemption, a second chance at life, and the opportunity to make it count.